Thank you very much, Frederica, for a kind introduction. Thank you, everybody. I would want to give you a presentation that I think would characterize biblical studies in a Ghanaian context. I'm forecasting not with the precision of a Jewish prophet, but on the basis of the material that I have. I hope you can all hear me and see.
Yes, all very well, thank you.
Okay, good. So my presentation is entitled The Bible and its Interpreters, Assessing the Future of Biblical Interpretation. I've changed that from scholarship, biblical interpretation from a West African context. Because of the limited nature of the time that is available to me, I would be skipping some portions of my paper, but I hope at the end of the day, I would be able to give you a good part of the content that I have prepared. So basically the presentation would have the following parts. After the introduction, I would be working on 4 main sections in a summarized way: the Bible and West African Christianity from a Ghanaian context, the Bible and African Christian theologies, African biblical studies from a Ghanaian context. Then I will look at some exegetical hermeneutical works of Ghanaian New Testament scholars. As to why scholars continue to read the Bible and why they will do so in the future is better appreciated and answered contextually, taking cognizance of factors that shape a given context within which biblical scholars find themselves and carry out their research on the Bible. When we cast attention onto the face of biblical scholarship in sub-Saharan Africa, we are at once presented with a picture that appears descriptively different from what one finds in other contexts. It is one that can be aptly and succinctly described in the words of the South African biblical scholar Gerald Wurst as interpreting the biblical text, and I quote him, interpreting the biblical text is never in African biblical hermeneutics an end in itself. Biblical interpretation is always about changing the African context. The implications of this orientation in biblical studies in the continent are easily discernible. It means that the African exegete hardly enjoys the luxury of stopping at decoding the zen of a biblical text as its authors might have intended it. Indeed, he or she has to move from exegetical concerns to hermeneutical ones, relating the exegeted text to the African reality shaped by multitudes of factors ranging from religious through socioeconomic to political ones. Similarly, the African exegete is also enjoined by the nature of biblical interpretation in the continent to prioritize the African context in the interpretive process, allowing the biblical text to confront and be confronted by the religious, political, socioeconomic, and cultural concerns and existential realities of Africans. Thus, changing the African context through biblical interpretation presents a reader-centered and context-sensitive biblical studies setting in sub-Saharan Africa, which takes seriously popular readings of the Bible as well. In light of that, my paper attempts to give a response to the question of the future of biblical interpretation in the continent from a Ghanaian perspective. Now, as has been observed in a related discussion elsewhere, African biblical scholars have learned to conduct their tasks and articulate their findings in a contextualized and specified manner due to the diversity of the African continent. Therefore, even though my presentation focuses on West Africa, it bases the discussion on Ghana as a case study. In this specified manner, the central claim or observation of my paper is that given the reader and context-centered nature of biblical interpretation in Africa, the role of the Bible in African Christianity and African theology, the Bible will continue to be researched and will receive increased critical attention in the times ahead, not necessarily for its own sake, but due to its documented influence in both religious and secular contexts in Ghana. The presentation will look at how the Bible and its interpretation have shaped Christianity in Ghana, its role in the emergence of African theology, and the African biblical studies focusing on mother tongue biblical hermeneutics, an emerging hermeneutical approach in biblical studies in Ghana. And lastly, some biblical research of selected New Testament exegetes, both established and emerging ones, will be presented. Now, the Bible and West African Christianity, the case of Ghana. We begin with the Bible and West African Christianity on Gerald West's observation that, quote, African biblical scholarship's home has been within African theologies and African Christianities. In other words, the settings within which African biblical exegesis and hermeneutics take place are 1, African theologies, and 2, African Christianities. In this section, the focus is on Ghanaian Christianity with our interest in the Bible's role therein.
Michael, sorry to interrupt. Your screen seems to be frozen. Could you maybe stop the screen sharing and restart it again, because we can't see the presentation at the moment?
Oh, okay.
If you just stop the screen sharing.
Yeah.
And then maybe share this presentation.
Okay, wait a moment.
Because we could only see the first slide.
Okay. That's strange.
Oh yeah, now we can see another slide.
Okay, let me see if I would.
I think it might just work now. If you just continue with
the
slide you're at, then it should be fine.
Okay, all right. You're welcome. Yeah, so I was on the Bible and West African Christianity. I continue there with the following. The literature on West African Christianity agree in demarcating the Christian landscape in the sub-region into 3 loosely reciprocally influencing streams of Christianity, namely mission-founded Christianity, African independent Christianity, and Pentecostal charismatic Christianity. We'll skip this part. In Ghana, Christianity is undeniably the predominant religion, attracting more than half of the population of the country. Moreover, it permeates every sector of the Ghanaian society in political, economic, and social sectors. That it is the predominant religion is further attested to by the use of Bible verses and parabiblical expressions on properties of individuals, such as vehicles, shops, even residential buildings, names of companies, among others. Additionally, Ghanaian Christianity has asserted its public role Okay, good. Additionally, Ghanaian Christianity has asserted its public relevance as an indispensable agent in national development, as many Ghanaian churches are key industry players in the areas of agriculture, education, health, among others. And as you can see on the slide, I'm showing you a recently constructed prison facility that the Church of Pentecost in Ghana, handed over to a Ghanaian prison service. Now to the Bible in Ghana and in Ghanaian Christianity. We have already mentioned the public display of Bible verses and biblical quotations in the country. It is a phenomenon that one cannot overlook in discussing Ghanaian Christianity. For instance, Bernard Carl observes that, and I quote from his original translation in German, dass das Christentum in Ghana die verbreitetste Religion darstellt und dass es als solche das gesamte Leben der Gläubigen durchdringt, wird ersichtlich an Fahrzeugaufschriften mit christlichen Referenz. Good. JZ Board ethnologically collected some of these quotes on vehicles in Ghana, most of which referred to the Bible, to the power of God. Some of these collected quotes include, "In God we trust," "Jesus is the answer," "God the ultimate giver," God is good, God will provide, among others. As I've asserted elsewhere, these quotes reflect in them the personal, existential, related interpretations of the Bible by the respective persons who assign the quotes to their properties. Moreover, it forms part of popular interpretation of the Bible in Ghana, which we have argued as forming a constitutive part of biblical interpretation in Africa. As John Mbiti has rightly asserted, quote, without the Bible, there will be no African Christianity, unquote. And indeed, Ghanaian Christianity is inconceivable without the Bible. This point is supported by looking at public display of biblical and parabiblical quotes to observe that the rise of African independent Christianity or African independent churches in the early 20th century was significantly propelled by the translation of the Bible into Ghanaian and other African mother tongues. The availability of the scriptures in African mother tongues created the possibility for Ghanaian Christians to gain access to what they considered as the very word of God, to read it for themselves and interpret it in light of their own existential realities. Through this, the interpretive and hermeneutical hegemony hitherto enjoyed by the Western-style trained interpreters in the mission-founded churches was duly challenged. Thus, the Bible provided, I'm skipping a portion of the paper here for the sake of time, considering that the Bible provided a great impetus to the indigenization of Christianity in Ghana and indeed much of Africa in the so-called African independent churches. Moreover, Kwame Bediako asserts that the emergence of African independent churches was part of the evident implication of translating the Christian scriptures into Ghanaian languages. Indeed, one can, on the basis of this brief sketch of the role of the Bible in Ghanaian Christianity, agree with Mbiti that the Bible and African Christianity are like Siamese twins, which cannot be separated. The point of the foregoing then is that the Bible, particularly the mother tongue Bible, has informed the emergence of indigenous Christianity in Ghana and has made its impact felt even in the secular spheres of the country. Therefore, once Christianity continues to grow numerically in Ghana and Africa, it is my projection that the Bible will continue to receive hermeneutical attention precisely for its role there. Now to the Bible and African theologies. The inseparable connection between the Bible and African Christianity is equally to be seen in African theology. I will skip a note on terminology here and move on to say that as a form of contextual theology, African theology arose in the heydays of the decolonization process in Africa, among other things, as a response to mission-founded mainline Christianity, which was considered as too westernized to meet the needs of the churches in Africa and African Christians themselves. However, the quest for an authentic African Christian theology raised the twin questions of methods and of sources. The latter is of concern for us here. While everyone agreed on the need for an African theology, as the discussions of the 1960s and 1970s among African theologians indicate, there was hardly any agreement on the exact sources of African theology. Nonetheless, one primary source that was not disputed was and is the Bible. For instance, Maluleke, in assessing the historical development of African Christian theologies, could not overlook the central role of the Bible in constructing African Christian theologies. He concluded, quote, the Bible has enjoyed a respected status and place in African theology, unquote. It received such a revered status and role because the trailblazers of African theologies such as John Mbiti and others insisted on the Bible as a non-negotiable source of African theologies. Indeed, Mbiti declared in those days that, quote, any viable theology must have a biblical basis, and African theology has begun to develop on this foundation, unquote. Likewise, Fasholi Luke insisted that, quote, the Bible is the basic and primary source for the development of African Christian theologies, unquote. Similarly, John Kobe of Ghana, argued that since it is, and I quote him, since it is the Christian faith that we wish to communicate in African terms, our starting point should be the source of the church's faith, that is the Bible, the foundation document of the church, unquote. Charles Nyamiti in Tanzania did not hold and express a contrary view, for he upheld the Bible as the primary source of African theology, indeed declaring it as the soul of theology. Lastly, John Ekem of Ghana as well agreed and argued that, quote, it cannot be denied that the Bible is the most important source of African Christian theological reflection and practice, unquote. Thus, from the onset, African theologians have unanimously accepted that there can be no such thing as African theology without the Bible. Even African women theologians in the construction of African women theologies did not express a divergent view, even though they engaged the Bible with a hermeneutic of suspicion. The point here is that, I'm skipping another portion. The point here is that just like the case of the Bible in African Christianity, once African theology thrives and expands its frontiers in the post-colonial era, and once the Bible continues to remain a primary source of the various theologies in this context-sensitive theological enterprise, the Bible in Africa will continually be read, interpreted, reinterpreted, not primarily for its own sake, but for its relevance for the African context, but not uncritically, because while its status as a primary source of African Christian theologies was not disputed, its interpretation has called for the urgent need to consider relevant biblical hermeneutics for the various African contexts. Marilyn K., whom we have already cited, criticized early African theologians for not going beyond recognizing the Bible as a primary source of African theology to the need for its interpretation. Indeed, he critiqued that, quote, what has been lacking is a vigorous debate on biblical hermeneutics. It was almost as if some of these theologians were afraid to alert African Christians to the fact that the Bible can and needs to be interpreted, unquote. In relation to Madulike's concern, however, one should, in agreement with Chama Kawunda, quote, stress that while seemingly absolutizing the Bible, many African theologians are aware that the Bible does not contain claim it and have it solutions to African existential challenges. Accordingly, African biblical scholars have developed hermeneutical approaches that have sought to interpret the Bible in light of the African context with their unique realities and worldview. That's why we should now turn our attention to African biblical studies, focusing on Ghana. In talking about African biblical studies, we should recall Gerald West's assertion that interpreting the Bible in Africa is never an end in itself, but a means to effect contextual changes and transformation in Africa. With this interpretive goal, African biblical scholars have operated within three poles: the pole of the biblical text, the pole of the African context, and the pole of the African biblical scholar, African biblical interpreter, I should say, both trained and untrained, who tries to bring both text and context into dialogue. This, for Gerald West, makes African biblical study theoretically tripolar. This does not imply that African biblical scholars do not engage in purely exegetical exercises. For indeed, Upong has drawn attention to the fact that, quote, there are two currents of academic readings of the Bible in Africa. One follows the Western, while the other follows the African pattern of linking the text with the African context. Many African authors publish in both patterns, unquote. Now, the description that I'm giving to African biblical studies here pertains more to the second pattern of linking the biblical text to the African context. And now the following hermeneutical approaches prevail or are evident in African biblical studies. I would skip that and go straight to the one that I want to share with you, which is mother tongue biblical hermeneutics. Mother tongue biblical hermeneutics. Yeah, Mother tongue biblical hermeneutics as an emerging discipline and approach to biblical studies in West Africa is largely advanced by Ghanaian biblical scholars like John Ekem, E.Y. Koshi, Philip Lai, Jonathan Kuwono Ajawato, among others. Now, Ekem defines it as, quote, a discipline devoted to the interpretation and reinterpretation of biblical texts in languages considered by speakers as their first languages into which they were born, unquote. For Kuwono Ajawato, it is a scholarly engagement of both the indigenous language translation of the Bible in order to understand what they say and mean to their readers, unquote. Thus, African mother tongue Bibles are at the center of this interpretive approach. Examples of mother tongue biblical Bibles in Ghana include the Asante Twi Bible, the Kusa Bible, the Ga Bible, the Dabani Bible, among others. It is essential to recall at this point that the mother tongue scriptures orchestrated the emergence of an indigenous Christianity typified in the so-called African independent churches. We also see in connection with mother tongue biblical hermeneutics the impact of the mother tongue Bibles on African biblical studies. They have laid necessity on Ghanaian biblical scholars to design and dedicate an interpretive approach to them. The necessity emerges from the observation that although mother tongue Bibles afford Ghanaians the opportunity to interpret the Bible from their unique African worldview as they read them frequently, indeed both during private devotions and church services, yet they have translation-related problems which require academic attention. Hence, they need to study these translations and through that facilitate their reception by their respective reading communities. Methodologically, it employs an eclectic approach, picking and choosing methods from different relevant fields of study. For example, exegesis, of course, translation studies, linguistics, philology, African mother tongues, among others. Its results propose new or retranslations of a studied text in a chosen mother tongue Bible. It is a demanding interpretive approach as it exacts from the Ghanaian biblical scholar who uses it extensive knowledge of biblical exegesis, translation studies, knowledge of ancient biblical languages such as Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, knowledge of African mother tongues, not least the one into which the text is being studied, the study text has been translated, and indeed knowledge of African culture, religion, and philosophy. In light of the foregoing, and I will skip this other section, in light of the foregoing, we need to make the following points. First, it can be established with mother tongue biblical hermeneutics that biblical interpretation in Ghana and indeed much of sub-Saharan Africa is indeed context sensitive and reader centered. Secondly, given the impact of mother tongue Bibles on African Christianity, as we saw in the previous section, and their impact on biblical studies in terms of the emergence of mother tongue biblical hermeneutics, one can be on a safe ground in projecting that particularly the mother tongue Bibles will find increasing attention in Ghanaian biblical studies, not for its own sake, but because of its dynamic reception in the country. Another basis for such projection can be found in specific works of some Ghanaian New Testament scholars, to which we should now turn, and that should be the last section of my presentation. I start with John Ekem. He can rightly be considered, in light of his publications and academic positions, as a key proponent of mother tongue biblical hermeneutics in Ghana. He reflects on his reason for contributing and advancing this approach as the result of his studies abroad in Germany and his engagement in Bible translation projects in Ghana as a translation consultant. Through this experience, he reveals that, quote, "It dawned on me that when the Bible translations have been provided for communities in their local languages, efforts should be made to help these communities interact effectively with the translated scripture through the provision of local language Bible commentaries, local language Bible dictionaries, and other study aids." Unquote. In this submission, he reviews the trajectory that his academic output in the area of mother tongue biblical hermeneutics has followed. That is, academic production of mother tongue biblical material, which will facilitate.
Michael, sorry that I have to interrupt you. We are unfortunately well over time. I would give you 1 minute to quickly wrap up.
Okay.
Sorry to.
Okay, so yeah, I would let me wrap up then. So I was on John Eckham, and basically Eckham contributes to this particular hermeneutical approach, and it's basically a reader-centered, which is designed to help the popular reader understand the translated text. The same thing is done by John Eckham, Kuwono Ajawato, and at the end of the day, the point that is being made here is that the context-sensitive nature of the biblical interpretation or biblical studies in Ghana and Africa will indeed feed into increased attention to biblical studies. To increase attention to in the Bible in terms of research, in terms of reading and interpretation. And I want to conclude just to draw your attention, just if you permit me, to a younger biblical scholar who is working on miracle stories in the New Testament in the Ghanaian context. And he, I consider as a more critical voice going forward. And basically what he does with the Bible, New Testament miracle stories in the Ghanaian context is to advocate for a more critical approach to it, not absolutizing the Bible and the biblical text in the Ghanaian context without recourse to their original context, that is exegesis. Therefore, let me just quickly read this conclusion. It has been argued that biblical interpretation in Africa is generally context-sensitive and reader-centered. With the case of Ghana, this has been demonstrated focusing on mother tongue biblical hermeneutics. Thus, when we return to the framing question of this presentation, namely why do scholars and non-scholars currently engage in the Bible and why they will do so in the future, a response from a Ghanaian context is that because the Bible has impacted and continued to impact not only Ghanaian Christianity, African theology with its local Ghanaian versions, but also the Ghanaian society at large. Therefore, biblical interpretation will continue to seek the Bible's relevance for both religious and secular communities, even if from an increasing critical perspective. Thank you.